Welcome to the final session for today, the Mines, Norman and Future Trends panel discussion. My name's Keith Baldry. I'm with the South Australian Environment Protection Authority. I'd like to acknowledge this is Kaurna country. We pay our respects to Kaurna elders past, present, emerging. I'd like to just say straight away thanks to our panel members. I was looking through the experience we have here, and if you add mine in, we've got just about 200 years worth of experience in radiation and mining industry, which is a bit of a worry, but probably good for getting some insights. The plan for this session is I'm going to ask each of the panel members to give a brief 3 to 5 minute statement on an area that is of particular relevance and interest to them. I'll introduce each of them at the time, and following that we'll have a panel discussion, and I encourage you to use the Q&A app to put your questions in, and then we'll and make them interesting and hard questions if you like, and then we'll do that for about an hour. So without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Donald Cool. Donald's a member of the main commission of ICRP, chair of Committee 4 on application of the Commission's recommendations. He is a technical executive with the Electric Power Research Institute in the US and has had a career of more than 3 decades with the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He is also a council member of the US National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements and a fellow of the Health Physics Society. So welcome, Donald. And
Testing one. There we go. That's better. See, so I've already managed to crash a microphone. And I drew the short straw leading off. I'm told because I managed to be first in answering the email inviting some of the questions. Okay, in any case. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad that all of you are here. I think it's an excellent opportunity for us to sit back and to think for a moment about where do we want to go? You've heard throughout the course of the day a tremendous number of things related to naturally occurring material, norm, and other activities. And so I'd like to sort of set a stage for some of the rest of this by noting that in the ICRP's system of protection, norm is an example. If you read the paragraphs that Jean-François Leconte put up earlier, it says that you have existing exposure situations, a couple of well-known examples being, and norm is listed there. And depending on how you read it, if you're in the United States, you probably read it differently than if you're in Australia or in the United Kingdom. You can say, well, that means that everything must be an existing exposure situation, or it's an example, which maybe leaves open a bit of flexibility. But I'd like to point out to you that it is just one of a whole set of things that relate to existing exposure situations. And in fact, the category covers an incredible range of activities and circumstances and situations. So it immediately becomes difficult to say that there's a single one-size-fits-all approach to how you would do this. And what we've already heard today is that it's pretty clear there's not a one-size-fits-all. And it's pretty clear that in trying to get a coherent and a consistent approach to all of these activities, what maybe starts out very simply as optimize protection and use individual dose criteria, reference levels, constraints, perhaps in some cases dose limits, all that sounds very simple until you start to get into the details of what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, when a regulator might need to draw a boundary for purposes of judging the effectiveness of a radiological protection program. Because that's what regulators not only like to do, they have to do. I was one for 33 years. I managed the U.S. program for radioactive materials, and I understand well that there have to be clear demarcations of when you're doing okay in terms of a user and when you're not. And that in and of itself starts to make it difficult to think about things like a graded approach. Because a graded approach requires that you think about what are the right things to do, what are the right requirements to impose, and to actually be willing to say that if some particular requirement or piece is not contributing at all to improving the safety of the individuals in the situation, then why bother? And therein lieth one of the first difficulties, is getting ourselves out of the mindset of, we've got a nice little system, here's another piece, I'm going to apply the system, and full stop. Because it actually requires a bit of thinking and process that goes along with it. Now, I recognize that historically we all developed our regulations for what we call practices back then. We started to introduce things, we saw there were issues, we started to write requirements, we started to draw boundaries around things. We wanted to make sure that people didn't burn their skin, and we wanted to make sure that we were reducing the number of cancers, on and on and on. Now that we've moved to an approach where we try to apply consistently optimization with those criteria, we still have the issue that all of the regulations were written over there in this space of practices, and I'll call it planned exposure situations. So where, as a regulatory authority, do you go to look for the tools of the trade? Planned exposure situations, because that's where you wrote the requirements. But in fact, I'm going to suggest to you that that set of tools should be equally applicable in any situation and circumstance, to the extent that they make sense and help you manage the situation. ICRP has started the process of reviewing the system of protection. So I'm sure somebody's getting on their app saying, so when is the new recommendations going to come out? And the answer is, I don't know. Don't plan on any particular date, because in fact, what we want to do is to talk with all of you. What are the things that need to be looked at? What are the different options and opportunities? We've not made any decisions yet. We want to engage in an open process to sort out what are the right sort of things that can actually refine and improve the system of protection and your ability to implement it. And if we can take another little step on that road today in this discussion, then I will be very happy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donald. So I'd like to introduce John Takala next. John's worked for nearly 30 years in the uranium industry. He's Director of Safety, Health, Environment and Quality Systems at Cameco Corporation, and provides direction for the corporate programs in the area of safety, radiation protection, environment, quality and audit. He's been a member of ICRP Committee 4 since 2013. So welcome, John.
Thank you. So in my short bio, I said I've been in the uranium mining industry for nearly 30 years. And in this time, probably as I progressed in my career, see my feet are in two worlds, the nuclear world and the mining world. And I'd say mining, because most of my mining colleagues wouldn't recognize that they're in the norm world. We heard Jean-Francois Lecomte talk about, well, doses are generally low in a lot of norm activities. The RP culture is often quite weak or non-existent. And I've seen that over the years with the culture shock from engineers, safety professionals coming in from other industries and they look at what we're doing with bewilderment for a while, and then they get used to this is just how things are in uranium. I'd echo a number of Frank Harris's colorful comments from the morning session, but it did pick up on a number of the themes that I was thinking about. So I'm been working diligently away as an RP professional for last few decades, and in my neat little radiation protection garden, getting everything neat and organized and all good. So what have I been worrying about over the last number of years, last 10 years? Well, wound dosimetry. The ICRP came out with some very useful models that were particularly timeful as we were dealing with a particular incident. We've recognized that this is something we hadn't thought a whole lot about and have incorporated that into our emergency dosimetry program. Lens of the eye has been very topical since 2011. How are we going to measure this? Is there dosimeters in Canada that are going to measure HP3? Change to radon, conversion factors, how's that going to play out for us? All these things that have been occupying my radiation brain, but none of those would resonate at all outside of our little world. And look at my neat little garden. It's a jungle out there. There's from very little recognition of what's going on. Jean-Francois talked about the first stage of just characterizing the problem. I just speak in Canada. I've talked with RP regulators at the provincial level, which would have the responsibility for the non-uranium mining worlds. And the most basic thing, so what are the radon levels in underground mines? Don't know. What are the plans to characterize them? Blank stare. And there's been a little bit of work here and there, but anything systematic, at the most basic level, is there a problem out there? Sadly, often we don't know. Not that there's probably most mines are fine, but there will be some that it may not be so good. We haven't even got that far yet. Frank talked about the UNSCIR report showing the exposures in the norm industry predominate, and it's probably an underestimate because it's not fully characterized. So that's, I think, something that extending the good practices that we have beyond what's being done right now is a key consideration. But the full meal deal, all the rigor, that binary approach that Frank talked about is a barrier, and how to make that practically a graded approach, I think that'll be a challenge. When I look at, we heard about some of the historic radon cohorts this morning, one of them from Canada, fluorspar in Newfoundland. That was not a uranium mine. That was a fluorspar mine. No, it was norm, unrecognized, very high exposures. I've seen the radiation monitoring data from 90-ish% of the uranium mines around the world through IAEA work. I'm pretty confident that it'll be slim pickings for future epidemiology for uranium mines, but I'm much less confident that there aren't some surprises out there in other mines. And I think that's we have to get better collectively at making sure there isn't another fluorspar mine situation.
Thanks very much, John, for that. I would like to introduce Analia Canoba next. Analia works at the Nuclear Regulatory Authority in Argentina. She's worked there for more than 25 years, and she leads the Measurement and Assessments in Radiation Protection Department. Analia has experience in radiological environmental impact assessment, radon gas measurement, radiochemical laboratories, and characterization and evaluation of norm industries. Analia has been a member of ICRP Committee 4 since 2013 also. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's working? Okay. Good afternoon to everybody. My idea was to share with you the difficulties that we have to face when several years ago, we decided to begin with the characterization of these industries with norm. And the same as John says, for us was something new because we work from the nuclear regulator. And the first thing we have to decide is how to enter in contact with these industries, taking in mind that there wasn't any standard, any law. So it was difficult for the industry to open their installations to us to make the characterization because the question was, what is the obligation, what will happen after that? So we have to invest a lot of time, but it was very fruitful to take in contact with professionals, so association of professionals, some chambers, group, for example, the oil and gas industries and the mines, trying to explain the situation, to explain the problem, what will be the benefits after that. And then we gain some confidence, and they open their industries so as to be able to perform the characterization. Then after that, we also realize that we maybe know something much or lower about the radiation protection, but to do this in an efficiently manner, we have to learn a lot about the processes of these industries. If not, it is very difficult to do an adequate characterization. So it was a feedback between the industry and from the regulator. And also we realized how huge were these industries. That is why we have to learn. And then also the resources was another problem that we have to face. We have limited resources. So I think one lesson was that to perform an adequate characterization, we have to work together with the industries and with the worker. I think this is very beneficial and very maybe different from what we are accustomed to. In parallel, we have another issue. There wasn't an institution responsible of the control. So we have to, again, keep in contact with other ministries, Environmental Ministry, Ministry of Labor, Health Ministry, and it was important to decide who is going to be the sign of the responsibility. And again, we were surprised, for example, that from labor, some people know about radon. And they know that it was another risk. So another important issue is to know not to overlap with other institutions, because maybe we are duplicating the work, and it is important to work together, like synergism. Another observations we have after we are able to perform the characterization is something that was mentioned in the morning, that sometimes we measure a lot of materials will very above levels of activity concentration of 1 becquerel per grams in scales, sludge. But that was not the important issue. That was a starter for us to pay attention. What is important is to analyze the scenario, to have all the framework, and also as Jean-François says, these installations are very ordered, have a lot of procedures, and they have a lot of procedures for other hazards. So it is very important to integrate and not to have the impulse to say, I'm going to license this. Because of this, because of the lack of resources, on many problems of the framework, we really act in like a graded approach as we understand, is not licensing because we cannot, it is impossible for us, but of course because it is not make sense. The things, the controls have to be justified in relation with what we want how do we want to optimize. And that is the subject that we are working. And just to finish an important issue is that happens in our region is that still there are many industries and workers that they are not informed about the problem. So I think this is an important issue for many countries, how to communicate, because I think at this moment it is a moral and an ethical right that we know the problem and we need these people to be informed. Thank you.
Thank you, Analia, very much for that. Stephen Long is Assistant Director of Instrumentation and Measurement Systems with ARPANSA. Stephen was heavily involved in the remediation of the former nuclear test site at Maralinga, and I worked with Stephen at the time. Stephen is currently a member of ICRP Task Group 8, developing the publication on application of the Commission's recommendations to exposures resulting from contaminated sites from past activities. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. I think the ICRP's revised dose coefficients for radon pose a significant challenge for the radiation protection community because workers in many industries may be exposed to radon at levels that result in doses greater than 10 millisieverts per year. And most of those industries would not normally be considered in the radiation protection legislation and probably have not had the radiation protection regulations applied to them. Examples for such industries are show caves, health spas, and underground mines. Regardless of the status of such industries in radiation protection legislation, the employers have a duty of care to their workers to ensure that workplace risks, including exposure to radiation, is minimised. So the first challenge is making those industries aware of the risks posed by radon. And generally, the radiation protection bodies would not necessarily be best placed to engage with a lot of those industries in the first case. So I think there's a challenge in building cooperations with other groups that have better engagement with those industries. In most cases, the exposure of workers in these industries will be considered an existing exposure situation, as the exposure situation already exists when the decision on control has to be taken. So this poses a challenge for regulators as those industries should be subject to not the full impact the same way you would impose on a uranium mine. But as was said, the normal toolkit is to take out the full toolkit and apply that regardless. And the final challenge is identifying and applying changes to work practices to optimise worker doses without jeopardising the financial or social viability of those industries. So they were never developed for radiation protection in mind. You don't want to impose so strict regulations or so strict controls that you actually jeopardise the industry itself unnecessarily. And I think the final challenge for radiation protection is in regulating those industries, we may end up with workers receiving lower doses due to radon at work than they do at home. So I think there's a big challenge there in putting the whole regulation into perspective in terms of their overall exposure to radiation.
Thanks, Stephen. Jim Hondros contributes his fair share of the 200 years experience. He's got 35 years working in the resource industry in operational management and consulting roles. Radiation protection, work, health and safety, environment, community relations. He currently is working with a range of industry and regulatory organisations on the practical and sensible application of norm regulation. We might hear if he's achieved that or not. He's chair of the ARPA Task Group on Norm. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Keith. I'm hoping that I've got a few points that might really focus on some practical aspects here. And really these comments are based on observations over the last couple of years. I deliberately put the word sensible into that introduction because I think that's where we need to come from. We need to think sensibly and we need to stop and have a think. But the first point I'd like to make is around the graded approach. I think for the last 5 years we can all say, if not more, that almost every conference we go to, we've talked about the graded approach. We've had lots of presentations, and we continue to do that. And we produce documents, and we continue to have draft documents. But I don't think we really appreciate that the graded approach is actually a complex and fairly sophisticated concept. It requires both qualitative and quantitative assessment, and more importantly, it requires judgment. If we have judgment, it really means that different things mean different things to people, to groups of people. We heard from Dan yesterday who spoke about perspectives. Different groups have different perspectives on the same situation. So the graded approach is actually quite a sophisticated way of thinking about how you might regulate. And of course, when we talk about norm, as we heard this morning, there's an additional level of complexity. For industries with norm, we have, although Frank calls it a binary system, I call it an incomplete level of competence. And so we've got a sophisticated system being applied to a group of people who do not have the level of competence in radiation protection, as we've said, that the uranium mining industry have. And in a legal or controversial setting, and at a practical level, a graded approach generally collapses to ultra-conservatism or over-regulation. So from an industry perspective, and believe me when I say that some of the companies I work with, one of the worst things you can hear from an industry representative is when they say, just tell me what to do. And it's okay when they ask a consultant, because it's not as bad, but when they ask a regulator, just tell me what to do, then the regulator is compromised. The regulator is put into a situation where they have to pick the most conservative situation. So competency is really, really important. So I think for norm, our most pressing need is to get a clear model of the graded approach, a clear, simple model, or get rid of it and maybe recognise that we're not ready for it. The other way to think about it is we may not be able to prescribe the graded approach right now, and we may need to build it or it may need to grow. The second point I'd like to make is about standards. When developing new standards, guidelines or advisory documents, we really need to include the operational practitioners, not the overpaid consultants, but the operational practitioners, the ones who ultimately put the big documents into practice on the ground. And I don't believe it's good enough to say that we've invited comment. If new standards are impractical, then they risk getting in the way of really, when we want to manage real hazards. So I ask policy bodies, and I pick up your point, Don, policy bodies to actively seek industry input. It's hard, because when you talk to industry, they say, it's not core business. So on the other side, I push industry to get involved. It's hard, it's difficult, but the on-the-ground experience is invaluable. My final point is, as chair of the recently formed ARPA Task Group on Norm, our aim is to collect and establish a library of one-page case studies on anything to do with Norm, from management through to practical application. And the thinking behind it is that the learning exists in the stories. If we can see what's happening on the ground and take it from a 50-page case study into one or two clear learnings, then that's the free information. That's what we should be collecting. I think that's enough for now.
Thank you, Jim. Daniel Zavattiero is General Manager, State and Territory Relationships for the Minerals Council of Australia. He's been in that role since January, and prior to that was Executive Director Uranium. He's almost 30 years experience in management and marketing in the resource sector, predominantly with BHP, spanning multiple commodities including iron ore, base metals and uranium in Australia, Singapore and the Netherlands. Welcome, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. And thanks everyone for having me here. I guess I wanted to just want to make 3 points, but the first point, which can never be said enough, is the mining industry, and I'm probably going to speak very Australian focused, but the mining industry, clearly its number one priority is safety. So I don't think you're ever going to find a forum which says, radiation protection, it's secondary. I mean, to the extent that there are risks and hazards that need to be managed, I think this industry, as much as any other, if not more than any other, is going to pay close attention. Safety is always just work in progress. It's never a goal that's fully achieved, and so we should keep that in the back of our minds as we sort of think about radiation protection and regulation and whatnot. I think there's 3 points I wanted to make, and I guess for me, I talk more about uranium than the other norm. Most people here are using norm as in non-uranium, right? But for me, uranium is norm, and I often hear sometimes people talk about uranium norm and non-uranium norm, which frustrates me a little bit, because I think there are degrees of differences, but it's essentially the same hazard that needs to be managed. So there's 3 points I want to make. The first one is around discrimination, and it's a word that I use because in Australia I think we have regulations that discriminate against uranium as a commodity. We have some laws that say if you're a uranium mine, you trigger this or that additional review, this or that additional process, an approval process, even when the radiation hazard or the radiological hazard is really, really small and perhaps smaller than other non-uranium mines, like when you think about ISR mines, for example, which have a very low radiation hazard, yet an ISR uranium mine in Australia triggers an EPBC Act approval requirement, a federal approval requirement. And I just want to make the point around discrimination, that we should, as much as possible in regulation and in legislation, remove those discriminations and focus on what's the hazard and the significance of that hazard and whether that needs to be managed or not. And as opposed to labelling, because you're uranium, you have to go through these or those hoops. The second point I want to make is around duplication. We've, for a long time in the uranium sector, talked about we don't shy away from regulation. We don't shy away from standards. We're not asking for standards to be reduced or to be compromised. What we do want is efficiency and effective regulation. And over the years, we've seen, and some of it due to discrimination, but we've seen duplication in our system. And I think part of that is the fact that we're not the only country to run a federated model where we have a national government, but also state or provincial governments. Other countries have to deal with those kinds of that kind of governmental architecture, and when you have those sort of things, there's always the possibility of duplication. So I think as much as possible that should be a guiding principle around regulation and ensuring that we don't have that duplication. And the final point I wanted to make is around communication. And I think when it comes to radiation, I'm not a radiation expert. I don't have a science background. I've worked in the uranium sector for some time, and I've worked with people like Jim and whatnot. But I come at this very much as a layperson. So I sit and listen to these experts, and I absorb this information as someone who's trying to understand it, almost like a person having a conversation over the proverbial barbecue. So, and I often think about how we communicate, how we. It's one thing to have the science and the understanding, but it's another thing to work out, to have reasonable mechanisms to communicate with both the workforce and the public. And I think we do have an issue in this space and in this sector when it comes to radiation, because we have, I don't want to say LNT, I hate the LNT expression, but I think this idea that there's no safe dose, we can't talk about thresholds, we can't talk about what is a safe level. This makes it very difficult for lay people to really understand and engage with. And so I always, I guess that's my final comment is around, it's one thing to sort of come up with the knowledge and the understanding, but we should also keep in mind how are we going to communicate that knowledge and understanding to an audience of people who have vested interests, stakeholders, so that they can make the right decisions and the right judgments around risk and what's acceptable risk for them.
Thanks, Dan, very much for that. One of the things that has been talked about is that we should take a risk and hazard-based approach to regulating in the norm space. Now, I think uranium mining has a system, and there's not much that we're going to do to change the basis for the regulation in that space. But in norm, there are new players, there are new activities. How do we decide what constitutes a risk or a hazard that is worth intervening in their business? So how do we take a risk and grade it? Practically, how do we take a risk-based approach to stepping into these industries that have not been regulated? And I'll take volunteers to start with that one. Or I'll pick somebody.
Just because of a microphone, that's all. The system that exists with the, let's call it the 1 becquerel per gram, is still sound. As long as we recognise that 1 becquerel per gram is the number at which you have a look. It's not the level at which you necessarily regulate. And I think we sometimes forget the fact that it's the level that you have a look.
I'm just interested in perspectives here.
And one of the other things is, and that's why I say I think radon is a challenge to radiation protection, is we're accepting, in terms of control of radon for the public, that 10 millisieverts a year is roughly acceptable. We're not going to go and suggest people change their houses or whatever if they're just slightly below 10 millisieverts a year. So I think that's another thing that we need to consider in terms of the norm industry is it in that range of 1 to 20? Is it in a reasonable area of that 1 to 20 millisieverts that's there for existing exposure reference level? So I think that's the challenge, is getting our mindset out of as low as reasonably achievable, thinking that means 0, to as low as reasonably achievable for an industry.
This is Dan's point about give me the safe level, isn't it?
Well, I get my point was a more general point, I think, around around that communication and around you giving people information that they need to know in order to make informed decisions. But I think on the issue of non-uranium norm, for example, other mines, other activities, the interesting thing about this for me is a lot of the management techniques to deal with these kind of hazards are pretty generic anyway. So, for example, a modern underground mine would have pretty significant ventilation, which is going to deal with. So I guess one question I have is how much would change? I mean, so to the extent that you identify a hazard, if it's being managed consciously or unconsciously, is that an issue?
So let me just build on that a little bit, because I agree with you. Step one has to be you have to go look. If you don't have any information, then you do anything you want, but you're never going to get there. But once you've had a look, the next step is to look at all of the context that goes around it. And the point that you made, in fact, a point that gets made in the ICRP publication coming out, is the next question is, what's already being done? Because in fact, there may be things that are already being done and that may be perfectly appropriate. Or it may be the things that are being done need just a little bit of tweaking or refinement. And the danger is that we'll go and characterize it and somebody will run around like Chicken Little and saying, the sky is falling, I detected a becquerel. And they will get themselves into their little silo of radiation, and we'll see if we can get rid of the becquerel, and that might not be reasonable.
And just to add to that, I mean, let's remember that we're dealing with industrial sites where there are other hazards to manage. And so, you know, as I said at the very beginning, you're talking about organisations that spend a lot of time on safety and managing real hazards and have real experience with these things. And the last thing I think anybody wants to do is to distract them onto reducing a risk that's already insignificant, and effectively and potentially take the eye off the ball, a more significant ball.
Yeah, and I think the comment from Frank in the morning session, it's not about the level, it's about the exposure situation. And just take Olympic Dam versus one of our underground mines in Canada. It's 0.05% or something at Olympic Dam, and it's 20% at MacArthur River, 300-ish times higher grade, but the doses are about the same. So we use shotcrete. We probably use a bit more shotcrete than it'd be being used at Olympic Dam, but we're doing the same thing. We're both ventilating quite rigorously. We've got extensive monitoring. So, but to Don's point, you have to look, and I agree, in a modern industrial mine with perhaps a bit of tweaking, you might be at, say, 10 or 11. A bit of tweaking, you're down at 2 or 3 pretty quickly. And maybe somebody's at much higher than 10 and needs a bit more tweaking. But I think that's getting the looking and then seeing what realistically needs to be done.
Yes, only regarding this, what I said is we measure a lot of materials with thousands of becquerel per grams on radium, or for example, 400 those microsievert per hour, but doesn't mean it is a real risk to the worker. You have to analyze all the exposure scenario. Another issue is that people have to be informed. So, for example, you work with the people responsible of safety and hygiene and health, and they know and they have to transmit this information to the workers, maybe with simple methodology, not necessary to make a licensing on something very special. That is what the meaning, I think something important is to say what is a characterization. Characterization not only measure materials or measure dose rate, is all the picture, all the scenario that may be general, but then a detailed scenario that I think is important to assess the risk and to justify the control measures.
Just one more comment. I think we've got to be very careful of generalising too. So within Australia, we might have a modern industrial mine who the focus is on safety, but in developing countries or other countries, it is important we don't over-prioritise radiation, because basic safety may or may not be there. And you can visit many mine sites around the place where there'll be this focus on radiation. They'll do the gamma measurements, but you walk into the smelter area and on every horizontal surface there is the usual pyramid of dust. And you take one look at the tin smelter and you go, God, I'm glad I'm not working up there. So generalisations are fraught with problems. And then there are many different risks we've got to consider.
Okay, thanks for that. That was some good insights into to approach that. Yeah. Now, on a sort of related subject, norm in ore concentrate might not meet our threshold for saying we need to intervene and regulate, but it might cause commercial issues for companies in shipping or selling product. So who is doing good work in addressing that? do you think, in the world, and what more can we do to improve the ability for people to deal with norm that's, I guess, perception is causing a problem? Dan, you've got the...
We've certainly seen that occasionally where we've had proposed projects recover another mineral, and you start going out and uranium mining? No, thanks. So it is a real issue.
So in fact, that's a really interesting question, because there's been a lot of work done in the response to events like Fukushima and others, where everyone gets a lot of vibrational energy about, well, what do I do with this commodity or that commodity? People don't want to buy it anymore because of the perception it's contaminated, whether or not it is. And there's been a lot of work done by the IAEA and various other organizations to try and help facilitate that. So there's a lot of work that's gone on. I don't think any of it has actually looked at the same implications of the question for naturally occurring materials, materials which may be refined and processed but may still have a little bit of norm going on. I forget which paper it was earlier today. How many times does the alarm go off as something goes through a port? And how many of those are norm materials? The answer is a lot and almost all. But I'm not convinced that very many people have actually thought through the same questions that have been thought through if it was an atom of cesium.
I think the models exist. Mineral sands move all around the world, and I think part of it is declaring it. But I am aware of some companies who do have the greater than 1 becquerel per gram material, and they spend a lot of time working with the customer. So you end up with a relationship. And really, the working with the customer is about education, is saying, this is what the risk is, this is what happens in the process, this is where the waste will end up, and this is then enough information you make decisions on, but there are some bad cases as well.
I think there's also some legacies that industries have to deal with, as in legacy legislation, regulation that comes in with one purpose and ends up having unintended consequences. So, for example, the EPBC Act in Australia comes in 1998. It clearly wanted to discriminate against uranium, and it tried to carve out mineral sands. So it wanted to put in place some hurdles and specific things that uranium mines would trigger a federal review and whatnot. And it clearly, people at the time thought, oh, hang on, maybe mineral sands might trip this up. So it actually has a caveat in there to say that mineral sands do not trigger this. But over the course of the last 20 years, various other pieces of the Act and interpretations of the Act and regulations that are associated with the Act have ended up tripping up various mineral sands projects. So you sort of think, well, why is that being tripped up? Is it because there's a real hazard? No, it's because someone tried, the original intent was X and probably not completely, it wasn't hazard-based, the original intent. It wasn't risk-based. It was, we want to have an extra control on the uranium industry. But in doing that, even despite the fact that you're trying to carve out other industries, they still got swept up in the loop, because it's very difficult when you try to take very targeted approaches to legislation. What would have perhaps been better at that time would be to say, to the extent that there's a radiological hazard, it needs to be assessed regardless of what its source is. But that's not the way it went. So I think there's some, similarly in Victoria, where I come from, there's an Act of Parliament, 1983, Nuclear Activities Prohibitions Act, which was again very much targeted at nuclear power and uranium mining, but potentially has clauses which impact other types of mines or other types of activities. So I think there's there's some thinking that we can bring to the fore in 2019, 2020 and beyond around cleaning up some of these things and refocusing attention back onto what is the hazard, what do we want to protect people from, and what's the most efficient and effective way to do that.
Okay.
That make sense?
Yep. So, and I'll check the app to see if it made sense out there as well. So it's great that we've got so much experience in norm uranium mining, radiation protection. Where's the pipeline for the young people? Is it there? Who's doing it well? If we're going to make all the progress, then where are the bright young things that are going to take us to that? Maybe, I don't know, Analia, how in Argentina do you find, for the young people, do you have?
So the question is from young people, how to be involved in this, how to engage them from the future.
Yes.
Well, maybe if we talk about the young people that work in our regulatory authority, I think what we are trying to be open-minded because as we are regulators, we have a very fixed mode of thinking. And I think that we have to be more open-minded, more practical. I think we have to make an interpretation of this, and this is that we are trying to do with the people, and also not to control or regulate in a theoretical way. I think it is important to be in contact with which are the processes, which is the problem, and to understand this. This is different. It was very different from, for example, when I began to the authority. I don't know which was related with you, but we are trying to do this. And also I see a difference between the young and the other people, for example, from the regulatory body that were not involved in this norm issue. I have to argue with my colleagues, for example, when they say, why you are so flexible with that? We are not protecting the people. The radiation is the same. We are very strict. We have to be very strict with this. So this is all a situation that we have. It is a very, very common question. And so we have this for the young people to understand, to be more realistic. And we have the problem with the other people that are very, very rigid. I have a very interesting conversation about the waste for the people from the waste management. And they say, why you are, because we are writing some guidelines and standards from this problem of the waste that I think is an important issue for the norm. And some people ask me, why? Because the number is 0.3 millisievert per year. Why you are talking about 1 millisievert per year? That's not correct. So I think we have the intention to work in a different way with the young, but also we have these big discussions to our nuclear colleagues. So I don't know which is your experience or how to deal with this.
Keith, I don't think it's solely our problem. If you look at the mining engineering intake in Australia at the moment, I think you can count the number of graduate mining engineers on one hand. You know, it's an industry issue, industry-wide issue is how do we get professionals into it. I'm aware of one company that's trying to make the whole resource development area sexy by doing things like talking about space. It's one of the reasons we put space on Thursday, is to try to make it a bit more interesting and just explore different ways of thinking and different ways of different career paths. But it's just not us. It's not just the radiation profession. It's the mining industry as a whole, I think.
So I'll reflect from a United States perspective. It's this and every other piece of the puzzle. Where are the next generation of radiation professionals going to come from? I was singly unsuccessful. Both of my daughters went off and did other things. Where are they going to come from? You talked about the number, counting number of people in one hand. You can almost count the number of graduate degrees in health physics in the United States the same way. There are very few programs. There's not a pipeline. We look down the road a few years when a bunch of us will finally decide, yeah, we've had enough, we're actually just going to retire. And it's a very scary prospect about where are the people who have some experience, they're gaining some experience, but they're also being challenged and like to think about the deeper implications of trying to move the system, not just be a technician. One of our issues, I'll contend, and this is in the nuclear power industry in the United States, they're really, really good at training technicians. That said, there's still not enough for the outages, but they're good at training technicians. They pay them really well. There's zero incentive for them to move further up in the chain because they can run around and make really good money and then have 6 months off.
Yeah, I think it's something at the Minerals Council we spend a bit of time thinking about, and Jim alluded to the idea of mining engineers, for example. We're doing a lot of work with universities, and we've produced this year there's more to mining careers, a booklet that we worked with universities and has been very popular in sort of showing the kind of careers that you can have in mining, the diversity of careers, really showcasing the way the mining industry is really the application of technology today, and which a lot of people, in fact, we did polling on this earlier in the year and before that, showing the sort of lack of really understanding around what modern mining is. So we've been very active this year, sort of in putting out more material. Even some of the ads that we've run and some of the member companies like BHP and others have run are really showing what modern mining is in Australia, and that is, a very modern, innovative, high-tech sector that can be really appealing to a lot of young people, and obviously high-paying. So there's great potential. And I think there's two things. One is the attraction of careers and roles in the sector, and I think the other thing is the sort of brand of the sector. And I think our advertising, I think it is moving the needle somewhat, but it's a slow burn. You've got to do these things over a long period of time, and I'm pretty hopeful. I'm pretty confident that that's going to be very effective. I think when it comes to the nuclear side, I'm really encouraged by things like AusYGN. I think some of the work that ANSTO's done in recent years has been really productive around, and more people, I think, in Australia are more aware of nuclear medicine, which is a way that people is reframing, say, uranium and nuclear technologies in the public mind away from sort of the weapons of the 70s and 80s towards what the opportunities and the benefits that come from nuclear technology understanding and development. So I think there's some real positive things in that space, in both the sort of the downstream end of nuclear and nuclear related issues, and also the upstream end of mining in general.
I guess just one final comment is also I think we have to look at our own, the way we advertise for employing people ourselves, is how many jobs do you see for people in health physics or whatever that don't require experience? Almost every job you see advertised is experience preferred. So where is the pathway? If that's the person you want to employ is somebody already with 3 or 4 years experience, how do they get it?
So, yeah, and we've taken in the radiation field in particular, a grow your own approach. So exactly that there are very few graduates at a master's level that come out from a health physics background in Canada. There's some, but often they're snapped up by the utilities and uranium mining. But our best successes have been local people, bright minds, get them in and teach them the trade, and they're committed locally. And we've done the same thing in the north, in Saskatchewan. Our mines are a couple of hours flight to the north. Sparsely, it's colder than Olympic Dam, but sparsely populated, similar sort of situation. And we hire a lot of people from the northern communities, the indigenous population. We have a very aggressive targets of 66%. We're 50-ish% from the indigenous communities, and having to bring their skill set up with, and the challenge now is getting more into, journeyman electricians, engineers to fill the higher skill jobs. But it's a very much grow your own approach.
I've got a message from Christopher Poole, who says the young people are standing next to our posters waiting for you to come and look at them. So I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that this is a real opportunity this week to meet some people who are here because they're enthusiastic about the business, and they and so we should, on both sides, sort of make the connections where we can. I know that the EPA in South Australia, we've got a young team. In fact, we've got 2 people that started with us yesterday who are here today, and so the young people are out there, and yeah, we should make the contacts and mentor and help and give them opportunities.
Is there an opportunity within industry, for industry being a very broad term, where we can move people around? So you might have someone within your organisation for a year, and then there's a commitment to send them to Canada to work in Cameco for a year, then etc. And we use the fact that it's an industry rather than, well, industry is an interesting term. It's really a collection of companies trying to put each other out of business, isn't it? But it's but if we took a more holistic approach, there might be a way of developing people.
I'm sure you're right. Yeah, yeah, I'm sure you're right. It's industry has the money, so don't leave it to government. I do have questions on the app, but I'm also conscious that there are people here who don't have access to that. Are there any questions from the floor that you'd like to put to the panel, if we can see? I think there's a microphone behind you.
Thank you for that. My name's John Matthews. I've been watching radiation issues since I was a member of the Australian Ionising Radiation Advisory Council in the 1980s. And of course, we got caught up in the security issues around the Maralinga experiments, and that led to the McClelland Royal Commission. More recently, I've been interested in the CT scan risks. And one of the things that has also emerged from the discussion just now is that the radon evidence is not only based on mine information, it's based on housing, and what we haven't done is actually explored the value of linking the effects of low-dose radiation into a coherent whole. I mean, we need to, I think, take the community more into our confidence. The ambiguities that we're struggling with, like, why should we regulate industry when we allow people to live in houses, not so much in Australia, of course, but with higher radon levels? It sort of establishes the principle that very low doses can have an effect. The radon data tell us that, and I think the CT data do too. And there would be advantages in trying to get health consumers more involved in the discussion. If, for one thing, it's a way of decreasing the pressure on the industry, because we need to understand what background does, what radiation does overall. It's not just the nuclear industry. So I'm sorry to have made what sounds a bit like a party political broadcast, but I really think we need to understand what's going on at the mechanistic level, and the signals that are coming out are, we're now concerned about very low doses, both in the industry, housing, and from medical diagnostic procedures. And that's where the growing edge is. That's where we're going to attract the young people into studying these problems. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Would anybody like to pick up on those points?
Why did everyone look at me? But okay. Because in fact, I think you're right, and I think it's extremely important that we continue to try and understand what's happening. And we know that there are things, if you listen to Dr. Liz Ansberry's Bo Lindell talk, maybe that was only yesterday, it seems like time is going so fast, but she was pointing out there that when you start to look into the details, you find all sorts of complexity. And that shouldn't be surprising. Biology is complex. You know, things are upregulated, things are downregulated. There are effects at multiple levels of organization. Do we have a way of connecting that with the epidemiology data in a way that begins to help to build the bridge between the biology and the epidemiology? I think it's a great challenge. Do I think that somewhere in there is the Holy Grail and we will suddenly have the answer? No, probably not. But that doesn't mean it's not a really good idea to try and continue to push that, to foster the understanding. And I'm going to take another piece just because you sort of teed it up. Communication is always a dialogue. We don't do a very good job when we're preaching. We do a much better job when we're listening to questions and answering the questions and reflecting on what is actually being experienced, what the concerns are, and how to help individuals learn better. That's a resource-intensive approach because that means you actually have to spend time. You actually have to interact with the person. You actually have to look into their eyes. Sometimes email doesn't work very well. But it's the way that you can gain one step at a time to further improvements in the process. And I think we need to be committed to do that as a profession, reaching out, and we need to be committed to do that with each other to improve our knowledge and improve the activities that we would wish to regulate and make recommendations on.
Thanks.
I think, well, I said radon is a challenge for the radiation protection community. It's also an opportunity to re-engage with the public about the risks of radiation, because we have to now start to talk to the population about how they are currently living with radiation, and how they can realistically manage those risks in their ordinary lives. That refreshes the conversation in terms of radiation in everybody's life, which I think for the last 3 decades, the general public hasn't been part of that conversation generally. They just don't consider radiation as something odd, man-made, to do with nuclear power, and that's about it. It's got nothing to do with their normal lives. So I think it gives us the opportunity to discuss that in terms of their ordinary lives.
Maybe just picking up on that point, one of the trends in recent years is obviously social media. So it enables the public to really connect and share ideas amongst themselves. Combine that with the fact that they don't trust government. Also add to the things that were done to them in years gone by in terms of scientists and governments knowing better. So how do we address that? The expectations from the community has gone up in terms of what they want in the way of information. Who's doing good work in this space? Where do we need to go in terms of engaging with communities?
It's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, it's very difficult to undo legacies like that. I mean, one of the things at the end of the day, trust is hard won and easily lost. And I think for a lot of people in industry today who had nothing to do with some of those old legacy events, which were terrible and I think did not reflect current values of anybody, we still are charged with, we still live with the legacy of, and the absolutely justified suspicion around the things you just mentioned, Keith. So I think that's really difficult. But at the end of the day, who's doing well are people of, I guess, are those companies or those organisations and agencies that are investing the time with communities. When you look around the world and see what works, what sort of stakeholder engagement and community engagement really works, it's that's willing and voluntary and allows plenty of time. And I think, if we look at things like citing waste repositories in Finland, for example, or Sweden, even here, that the allowance of plenty of time, the allowance for communities to engage and ask questions and to have a say in it is clearly a formula that works. But patience is obviously a critical factor to it. But it's not insurmountable. I mean, that's the key thing in terms of building community acceptance and support. I mean, there's reasons, there's examples around the world and reasons to feel hopeful that these are issues that can be discussed. As you said, Stephen, that you can engage with the community and work through those issues and respond to their queries and concerns.
On the radon issue, not so much on the industrial side, but on the home side in Canada, Health Canada has got a clear website putting out here the levels, testing, and they've been active in creating what I'd sort of say is a ecosystem of links with, Home Builders Association, the Lung Cancer Association, various health groups, all measurement organizations, all creating this, are you more interested in the measurement, you're more interested in the health, you're building a new home, they all point to this thing. So it's what I describe as a ecosystem of information that people can access, and they're with promotion campaigns, and that's, I'd say, raising the level of awareness on radon is something that needs to be looked at homes in Canada, but still a long ways to go.
In this sense of radon, I want to share with you an experience we have. We work with the schools, and schools that are neighborhoods, from example, from former uranium mines. So we have a radon campaign from these cities. And one thing that is very good is that we share with them, we give information, and then they send to them the detectors, and then sometimes we invite them to our laboratories to see which is also the system, and then I think that they are more confident because they see what we are doing. And also we gave to them a certification, like a doctor analysis, explaining what this means, the radon level. And I remember that talking about to engage young people, sometimes one or more of these people make their studies, they have to select a subject, and they work with us. It was like not too many young people, but there was a form of engagement. But I think it's very important to keep contact with the people. And just a little experience we are now in this moment is from mining waste from uranium mine tailings that are located very near a neighborhood. Previously, nobody was there, but now the tailings are there and the people are very, very crowded. And we have a very important issue with that, and people are against and they want the ties to move. And I think we are thinking how to communicate, how to perform a strategy, because my feeling is we have made all the characterization. There is no technical reasons to move that. And you know from the experience that moving the tailings is not a good experience at all. And what I'm thinking is, well, okay, we have to talk with the people, we have to invest time, we have to answer all their thinkings, and at least if we have to move the tailings, I think we have to document everything that if we are doing, we are not doing because it is risky for the people, because maybe in the future, not me, not the people may think that was moved because it was a problem, you understand? So we are technical. It is very difficult for us how to manage this situation of the risky, how to communicate to the people. But at least we have to do the effort and try to do it.
Dan poked me then. So, and yes, there's a whole range of scenarios. But I want to come back to something I said at the beginning. I think it's about the mechanism for capturing the stories. The stories are full of diamonds. So exactly what you said around the consultation, exactly what you said about trust. You know, if we can collect the stories and pull out the bits, then we have a toolkit of ways of doing it. I think too many times at a conference we talk about the structure and the dot points and things like that, and I think it's more important we talk about the stories and pull out what the particular learnings are and use what fits.
So now you're kind of a little bit like what we talked about earlier, this idea that, and I guess it's something for ICRP to consider, when it's one thing to come up with the science and to come up with the understandings, but it's another thing to be able to put it into a way that it's digestible for people, for stakeholders. And we normally think of workers and the public is normally the spouses and partners of the workers. So, you know, they both have a need to understand what the hazard is, how it's being managed, what the risks are, and I think that's a big challenge in this space. I've not been in it for as long as many people around here, but it surprises me sometimes that we still haven't come up with really clear ways to communicate this. I know, Jim, you've been in a lot of communities and had these kind of discussions, and I think I've asked you before, what works, what doesn't work, you know? So it's.
That's why you prodded me, wasn't it? But we can. I think it's about capturing the stories. So I can give you 100 stories right now, but I think the key is capturing that. How do we get that onto one page and pick the 1 or 2 dot points out of it? And one of the desires we have on the task group is to do that, is to collect the stories around norm management, no matter how diverse they are, no matter how odd they are, and just have a library of 1 pages. Here's the story, here's the 2 or 3 learnings. And then that might evolve into finally a graded approach to regulation or graded approach to radiation management. But it's better than prescribing and telling people, I think. And I'm not going to tell that story.
There's a few comments from people saying that engaging with the community is something we should be doing, and there's links to engaging with young people who are new to the industry, and also we need to make sure that we engage with those people who come from countries or sectors where there is no established history of working in this area. How do they get into it, and how do they get involved? So we need to broaden who we speak to as well. So anyway, that was a really interesting discussion. We're coming towards the end. What I'd just like to give each panel member the opportunity to maybe think of the one big thing that we should be doing differently than we are at the moment. What's either the big thing that we need to address, or what's the big thing we're doing wrong now that needs to change? I might start with Stephen, because I think he might have a plane to catch and so if he needs to, if you see him dash off the stage, that'll be why.
Yeah, very tough question, and I don't have anything. There's too much running around in my head to summarise. Sorry, Keith.
That's all right, that's all right.
I was going to say the one big thing different you should do is you should have alcohol on the table for these panel sessions. I told you, I gave you the Graham Norton tip and you didn't take it, Keith. But I'll give you a better answer soon.
All right, I'll try to give you a serious answer. And it has nothing to do with a technical issue, and has everything to do with what we've been actually talking about the last few minutes. We, collectively, as a community, need to find ways to have these sorts of discussions and come together to figure out what's working, what's not working, what the options are to make it work better, and figure out how to make that then happen. And we're only going to do that if we have these kinds of discussions, if we have lots more engagement. We cannot afford to live in little towers anymore.
I think we just go right to left, yeah? So it might as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Excuse me.
Thanks, Stephen. Can we give Stephen a quick round of applause as he... thank you for your contribution.
I think, I guess... one thing we could do differently is, or do better, is I think for groups like ICRP and regulators to really consult as much as possible, particularly around the pragmatism of recommendations and guidelines. And I mean, I think the work all these documents and all these things that are put together are fantastic, and they're obviously, you know, vitally important, but it's really important that that people crafting them understand that there's going to be consumers for them who are going to translate them into real life situations, into real operations, real mines, real processing plants. So I think it's good to be theoretical, but it's really important that that at all levels people are very conscious of of the pragmatism of what's being crafted and developed. So to the extent that more and more consultation and more understanding of the pragmatic realities, I think that's something we can all do better.
Okay, I'll tell a quick story. I was doing some work in a remote Aboriginal community, Indigenous community, a couple of years ago, and the company had said that we would like the community to do the environmental monitoring. And the community had accepted that and was really happy to do that monitoring. And they said, Jim, can you go and train them? And Rose knows I tried to put some presentations together and was stressing for weeks about how am I going to get across the difference between gamma and alpha monitoring and surface contamination and uptake and soil monitoring and dust deposition and all that sort of stuff, and the technicalities of it. And I remember walking into the room, and there was the community had nominated 6 young people who that they had hoped would pick this up and then go on with their career. And I was worried as anything. And I walked in, and all 6 of them were on their smartphones, communicating and playing games. And I thought, I walked in with paradigm. And I had thought that I would need to get this technical information across, when in fact that was not the case. So the learning from me was that we don't know everything. Yeah, what we've got to do is we've got to engage, we've got to talk, we've got to listen, and we've got to look.
Yeah, to echo, we've done some of that, the outreach with communities, environmental quality communities. We have lakes in Saskatchewan, not deserts, and water is a critical things. We've had for 20 years working with local communities, them doing the sampling, explaining that, and there's reports saying, so it's people that they trust, that they know, that are collecting the fish, collecting the water sediment samples, and that's helped enormously in sort of build that credibility with the company and the regulators, that they see that, yeah, somebody that I know took those samples.
Well, I am the last. I think very important what Don's mentioned about the stakeholders' involvement and the confidence, and also to work together. And I think something to resume briefly in this sense of the graded approach, as Jean-Francois says, very clear, is to apply common sense in this control or regulation of this industry. I think common sense is, for all the people we are involved, it is very important. Thank you.
So I'd like to share real quickly a story from the past that still holds true meaning. Go all the way back to the TMI accident in Pennsylvania, 1979. And a year or so later, several of the folks in our regional office had gone out and they were doing some sampling in the river there that the plant is on. And when they were finished with the week, they held a public meeting, and they're busy trying to explain all the things they're doing. And they could see that the eyes were all glazing over and no one understood what they were doing. And the team leader stood up, and this is a rather famous, I'm not sure it's exactly quote. Okay, let me put it to you a different way. We caught a dozen fish. We took some measurements. We ate the rest. And with that, all of the technical just faded, and they had a nice discussion, and it worked beautifully. We ate the rest. Make it real for the people.
Thank you for that. I think it is interesting that if there's one big thing that we need to do, it's not lower doses or new regulations, it's actually talking to people and engaging with them. I'd like to thank our panel members, Don, Dan, Jim, John, and Analia, sorry. And I'd also like to thank everybody here for the questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question, but there were lots of them. And so can we put our hands together for the panel members for a great discussion. Thank you.